we are going to go over the configuration for a statsd backend for Ogre. If you don't know what Ogre is a CLI and daemon which delivers out-of-the-box coordination of health check reporting for Docker containers as defined by Docker labels. This is useful for helping to coordinate the health checks of a distributed system, specifically using Docker. So, without further ado, let's jump into the configuration for a statsd backend. Statsd is a popular collection mechanism which is often visualized by things like Grafana, and Ogre interacts with that by way of some very simple configuration. So let's take a look at the Ogre D config. What we have here are basically defaults with the exception of Ogre D bin, which I currently have set to where I am building because I'm going to be building Ogre from source. So pretty standard Go path. This can be set to whatever you like. If you're using the Docker image, the Ogre Docker image, it doesn't matter. You don't have to set that. But for convenience sake, because the make target for building Ogre will put it in the repository directory, I just put it as where I will be running the commands. It defaults to, if you do not set it, user local bin. So outside of that, the only other non-default is we're setting our log level to trace. This is left over from the previous screen recording I did for Prometheus target. I'm just leaving that to show that we can in fact have multiple backends, and the one that we're demonstrating is our statsd backend. So I am currently in an Ubuntu Bionic VM, logged in as root user, and there is a Docker container running statsd, Carbon, Grafana, Nginx. You can find the image, the Docker image online. I'll provide a link to it. But basically, it's an out-of-the-box working statsd collector and Grafana interface. But for our purposes of configuring Ogre, we need to just define the type statsd. We need to define where that server is. So in our case, the Docker container is binding ports between the host on 8125 and the receiving port of 8125 as well within the container. And then the prefix is what we will prefix all of our statsd labels as. So we are just going to use Ogre. And that will be part of the dot separated notation, which if you've used Grafana before, you're familiar with. Okay, so that's our configuration. Let's go ahead and run the make target. Well, again, sorry, we are in the project. So as if we have just cloned it and we are running, we're building from source. Again, Ubuntu Bionic. All right, and so that should put Ogre and Ogre D in our directory. Now you can, as I explained, move Ogre D wherever you like. If you wanted to put it in user local bin, that would be the default configuration. Again, with the Docker image, if you're using that, you do not have to worry about that. We have it configured to look exactly where it's landed. So let's go ahead and an Ogre version, make sure that things built correctly. It did. And let's go ahead and run Ogre start. And we should get a PID. Yep. If we run Ogre start again, we see that there's a process ID file made and it's been running. So let's go ahead and start spinning up some containers. So let's take a look at what's running. Alrighty. So let me trim that down a little bit. All of that nonsense is one of the containers is the statsd and Grafana, etc. But the one that we are concerned with is a container which is going to represent a service dependency. So we have a container foonoodle dep, which is going to be a dependency of the container we're about to spin up that Ogre will register health checks for. So let's take a look. If we do a docker inspect, we want to get the IP of this container so that we can establish a, oops, not good at talking and typing, so that we can establish a basic health check for our service container. So it has an internal IP address of 172.17.03. So let's copy that and let's spin up a new container to which Ogre will register checks. Also, before I go on, I should also point out that we do have a GUI here that we can use to see the checks that we have registered. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do a Docker run. We're going to run the container as a daemon. So this is going to represent our service container. So we're going to call it foonoodle because the other one is our dependency, which is foonoodle dep. We're going to give it a label, and we're going to say that label is Ogre health. So those are the prefixes that identify to Ogre that it's a health check. We're going to call this ping noodle dep, and it'll just be a simple ping for one packet. Wait for 1 second. Should we just hang or time out or whatever? And we're going to paste in that IP address of our dependency. Now, if you were using host networking and host names or some user-defined network for Docker, that you could use container names, or in a Kubernetes or what have you, you could use your host name and maybe dig for it or whatever. But in this case, we're just going to use the IP address. Now we need to provide another label of Ogre format backend, and we need to format the statsd backend, and all we need to do is provide true, and our container, or excuse me, our image that we're going to use is going to be Alpine latest. So again, as I've said, these labels are typically things that you would probably define in a Docker file, maybe as like a part of a base image or what have you, but we're just passing them on the command line flags here for the purpose of this demonstration. So let's go ahead and start that container, and we'll do a docker ps for the last two running. Oh, our foonoodle container did not run. It's probably because we need to go ahead and we have to remove that first. Foonoodle. And we need to make that y. All right. So now that we have our two containers running, this container here, foonoodle, being the one with our Ogre labels, and our other container, foonoodle dep, representing some type of dependency. So what we'll do is we'll toggle that dependency on and off with a docker stop and start to simulate the health of foonoodle going bad, essentially. So let's take a look at our interface here for our statsd reporting. And we can see that we have stats, Ogre, ping. This is, well, we have two because the label from a previous run persisted. So we named our check ping noodle dep. So we have stats ogre ping noodle, and dep is the one we want. And so right now, as we can see here, it is reporting 0. Perfect. So let's go ahead and toggle our dependency container. So we'll go ahead and do a docker stop foo noodle dep. And as that stops, we should see the graph essentially register that we now have a different exit code. Probably help if I lower this refresh rate to like 5 seconds and auto refresh. And there it is. The graph jumps, and we can make it a little bit more visually strong here. Let's see. Oh, let's see. What's the thickness now? Graph title. I've never been good at making this look pretty. Line mode, staircase, connected. Oh, there we go. So there we go. Have some color there. And we'll go ahead and start that back up to represent maybe a little flapping of a dependency. And this should recover. Give it a second here to refresh. And as we can see, it's starting to recover down here. And all the way down to 0. Perfect. Okay. So that's the basic configuration. Again, we're running Ogre here as the binary on the host. The difference between running it on the host and in a container is very, very minimal. The only thing is you have to mount the configuration into the container versus having it on the host. I guess we could also demonstrate while we're doing this how if we have a dependency go down, let's say, which will re-register our check back up here as it comes in. So our container just stopped, and we should see when this refreshes that the check has failed, and we start to go back up. So we can see that it's starting to come back up. Now we can also stop the container checks themselves through the Ogre CLI. So we can say docker or Ogre service docker stop. So stop running the checks. We should also see this come back down because we've stopped the checks. And so as we can see, it's starting to come back down, and then we can start them back up. So Ogre service docker start those checks that have already registered themselves back up. Now that being said, containers will register themselves dynamically. So as long as Ogre is running, a container with labels defined for health checks will register itself. As always, please, issues, bugs, comments, questions, put them on our GitHub. Feel free to reach out, and thanks for contributing.